Well, good evening, everybody. We're going to make a start. It's really lovely to see so many people here tonight, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. My name is Tom Nixon. I teach here at Courtauld in Medieval Art and Architecture, and I'm going to, in a moment, introduce both this speaker and this event, the annual ICMA Courtauld Lecture. Before I do that, I want to just very briefly highlight a couple of events that are coming up here that might be of interest to some of you. First, the final session, this seminar in our Medieval Work in Progress seminars on the 6th of March, when Elena Paulina Montero will talk about chivalry, justice and love, thinking about royal architecture in 14th century Castile. And then we also have, on the 26th of March, our very own Professor Alex Bovey giving her inaugural professorial lecture, The House of Mirth, Ethics of Laughter and Ridiculous Gothic Art. Both of those highly recommended in their different ways. And you can, oh no, it's fully booked. Well, maybe there'll be a, you can show up and draw. That's the star factor, but there may well be, there's always no shows, so it's worth if you can. But I want to turn to the business of this evening, which is to introduce our speaker. But first, I wanted to say a few words about the ICMA, the International Centre of Medieval Art. This lecture series, Nina and I were just looking up, was established in 1999, I think with John Loudon and Joanna Cannon here at the Courtauld, as a way for the ICMA to make its presence known in the UK and for students and scholars and those interested in medieval art to hear also from scholars based in the US. And the ICMA, as you may know, is the foremost and in some ways maybe the only umbrella organisation for those interested in medieval art, both in North America but also across the globe. And Nina, who was formerly president of the ICMA, can speak to this. But what I would like to do for you now is just to, as it were, give not a very hard sell, but to really encourage you, if you don't know about the International Centre for Medieval Art, to look them up and to join. You can see, if you click here, that they are very reasonable, incredibly reasonable rates actually for students, just $20 US, and for that you get Gesta, a hard copy of Gesta, which is, it says, is the premier scholarly journal for the history of medieval art. And you get online and print access to that. You get the ICMA News, which is a really fantastic resource and way of finding out what's going on both in North America and beyond. A whole series of study days, principally in the US, but also in connection with other exhibitions around the world and other events. The ICMA sponsors a number of conference sessions. They have a whole series of grants and awards. They have mentorship schemes, and they just are a kind of an opportunity for medievalists to get together and sort of love one another and feel supported and part of a kind of a broader community. And I really recommend it to you. So, having done the soft sell on the ICMA, it's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker, Professor Nina Rowe, who, as I mentioned, is a former president of the ICMA. She was there for from 2020 to 2023, I think. Not easy years to be president of the ICMA in many ways, but she's also professor of art history at Fordham University and the author of a number of major publications, most recently her book, The Illuminated World Chronicle, Tales from the Late Medieval City, was published by Yale University Press in 2020. She also has an important study, The Jew, the Cathedral, and the Medieval City, Synagoga and Ecclesia in the 13th century, that was published by Cambridge in, well, it doesn't say here, I think it was about 2012, 2013, and as well as numerous other articles. You might know her particularly as the editor of a collection of essays published in Studies in Iconography in 2012, Medieval Art History Today, Critical Terms. That's a set of essays that I return to a great deal, and if you don't know those essays, I really encourage you to go and look at those. Just for thinking about these key critical terms in art history, I think that Nina contributed one on other for that set of essays. She also was a co-editor of Whose Middle Ages? Teachable Moments for an Ill-Used Past in 2019. Also a very useful resource for thinking about the Middle Ages and how we can think about it through the lens of current political debates and issues. So tonight, Nina is going to speak for about an hour. We have time for questions after that, and then I hope that you will be able to join us in the research forum afterwards for some drinks and more informal conversation. But I'm going to dim the lights now. One final thing I should say, this session is being recorded, it will go online. Some of you might know that the speakers are quite sensitive here, or the microphones, so don't say anything scandalous, because sometimes it can get picked up by the microphones, and that has happened before. But thank you very much, Nina. I'm going to turn down the lights, and perhaps we can welcome you to the...
All right, I'll say thank you while you're working on the lights. Oh, it's so nice to be here. Thank you for the lovely introduction. It's really an honor and a thrill. And so I just want to offer a few words of thanks. I know we're all eager to get going, but I am truly grateful to Tom Nixon and to Jessica Barker for the invitation to come here to the Courtauld, and especially to Tom for managing arrangements for the visit. And at the ICMA, I thank the current president, Steve Perkinson, and the executive director, Ryan Freisinger. And I want to offer my special thanks to my esteemed colleague, Bill Vokley, whose generosity over the years has sustained this lecture series. And this series, it just does so much to bolster transatlantic connections and collaborations among medieval art historians. So this one's for you, Bill. So here we go. Can we make it a little darker?
Let's see. Really dark?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, that's good. Okay. In the cities of southern Germany, in the decades around the year 1500, urban leaders were concerned about dancing. An entry in the meeting minutes of the Nuremberg City Rat from 1485 reports that the men of the council have noticed and taken to heart the disorderly frivolity and expense that one sees with dancing. So much so, they go on to claim that to an uncomfortable degree, reputable members of society oftentimes are consumed with the practice. And I put up on the screen now a snippet of that text in English with the key terms in bold, and beneath it is the Middle High German original, along with an image of Nuremberg from the Liber Chronicarum, just to evoke that city feel. And another entry in the Nuremberg Municipal Archives from 1495 even more explicitly forbids the, quote, many unusual and unseemly new dances which daily are adopted. The text laments that these dances without a doubt are displeasing to God Almighty, and it makes a pronouncement that going forward, entertainers or minstrels are barred from encouraging the good men and women of Nuremberg to get riled up with dances that depart from the traditional modes. Now, what specifically might have been troubling to the members of the Nuremberg City Council in 1495? This administrative body granted permission for various kinds of dances every year at Fastnacht or Carnival. Indeed, we have from Nuremberg detailed accounts about which members of the urban populace were permitted to dance and parade around the city streets in those days before Lent. But here, the dancing seems to have spilled out into the everyday, and the kind of dancing being taken up was unsettling because it was in some way new. And so it seems that the men of the Nuremberg Rat sought to rein in festivities or to put up guardrails around customs already in play that were pushing the limits of the acceptable. Now, this is all interesting from the standpoint of social history or the history of late medieval urban celebrations. But what does this evidence reveal to us as art historians, either in relation to depictions of dancing or in terms of the audiences for images of dance? Now, on the former question, some scholars consider the new mode of dancing referenced in that second passage up on the screen to have been moves borrowed from peasant festivities. But I propose that at least in part, it was the kinds of twisting and gyrating on display here which were of concern. For that second Nuremberg text goes on to levy fines against the entertainers or minstrels who spur men and women to engage in dances, specifically where participants embrace and spin around one another. Now, there is ample spinning around and interpersonal engagement here in these reliefs that you're looking at, and it is easy to imagine that dance performances like those depicted here inspired hip shaking and twirling and grasping among audience members viewing the spectacle. The sculpted reliefs up on the screen are details of an ensemble ornamenting an oriel installed circa 1500 on a civic building not in Nuremberg, but farther south in the same cultural orbit in Innsbruck, in the Tyrolean region of Austria. And these dancing figures also were created to adorn a municipal space, one that was not far away in Munich. They were made around the year 1480. Now, these sculptures that I'm showing you of men twirling and leaping around, created in the final decades of the 15th century in Munich and Innsbruck, depict performers in the throes of a mode of dancing that was a veritable craze at the time. A vigorous choreography that looks very different than images of more restrained chain dances, such as that shown in this fresco from circa 1390. The measured movements delineated here may well represent the kinds of traditional dances that the men of the Nuremberg City Council sought to retain and to promote. We see a graceful and demure dance where people link up by holding hands and they move in unison. A crowned lady leads the group with alternating men and women gotten up in the elite fashions of the day trailing behind. The jumble of people at the right, where the man in two-toned hose seems to reach back with his left arm and to take the hand of the woman in red, suggests the tangle of a cajole or a roundelay dance, where people snake in and around, sometimes in a line, sometimes in a circle. Evidence that this mode was judged to be beautiful and elegant and honorable is found in descriptions of court dancing in Middle High German literature. Passages such as a snippet from the Trojana-Krieg by Konrad von Würzburg, a text composed around the 1280s and which remained popular into the 15th century. In Conrad's estimation, quote, "There has never been a nicer roundelay made up from any company than that which one sees winding here and there." But it is not all genteel padding around on the dance floor, even in those traditional modes. For Conrad continues that at these dances, feet shuffle softly and then soon start to leap. So although late medieval images from the Bavarian and Austrian region might refrain from showing gentlemen and ladies hopping about, epic texts can delight in descriptions of energetic dances, suggesting that members of the nobility or high-ranking burghers of cities habitually were spirited of foot when they were part of a cajole. Now, this fresco you've been looking at is in Schloss Rumpelstein, a complex in what is now Bolzano, Italy, but was part of the Tyrolean region of the medieval Austrian realm, several days' walk south of Innsbruck. The family who owned Rumpelstein Castle at the time when this fresco was painted were regional administrators of the empire, and like nobles and top-tier urban entrepreneurs of the day, they decked their halls with images of Arthurian epics, tournaments, and pastimes, such as ball games and dancing. Now, the wall painting and sculptures I've introduced place us in the space of performance and participation, the ballroom, the civic hall, the city square, where people viewed and took part in dances. The Conrad von Würzburg snippet of text that I cited suggests that at the end of the 14th century, when the fresco on the left was painted, folks in actuality were not quite as stiff on the dance floor as they appear to be in the painted image. And the quotes I shared from the archives of the Nuremberg Rat at my opening indicate that by the end of the 15th century, there was something newly freewheeling about the ways in which men and women were twirling on the dance floor, and that these men and women drew inspiration from performers, and that civic authorities could find such practices to be socially destabilizing. But if the images that you're looking at speak to the practices of dance, what about the theory of dance for people in the orbit of Tyrol and up to Bavaria, that sort of corridor from which I've been presenting evidence, from Bolzano up to Innsbruck to Munich and beyond up to Nuremberg? Can we understand in more precise terms attitudes and expectations connected to dancing in that region in the 14th and 15th centuries? Well, one can seek the theory that may have governed the attitudes of intellectuals as well as more general audiences by investigating vernacular illuminated manuscripts, specifically Middle High German texts in illustrated books made for upper-tier burghers and lower nobles in the High and Late Middle Ages. That's the kind of manuscript that housed the image that you're looking at. It's a picture, as you can see from the rubric, about dancing people, von tanzenden Leuten. The manuscript in which this image appears, it has paper leaves and was created in Tyrol or nearby after about the year 1450. But the text appearing in this manuscript was not composed in the 15th century. That is, as was not unusual for medieval books. We have verses which were first composed around the year 1300, but which remained popular over the generations, being recopied and sometimes, as here, spiffed up with images. The text itself is known as der Renner, or the runner, or the courier, and it was written by one Hugo von Trumberg, who was active in the city of Bamberg at the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th. Here is an image of the courier from the opening of that same manuscript now in Munich. Not exactly an author portrait of Hugo, but an image of the narrator who speaks in the first person, the I voice, throughout the text. And the story told by the Renner is a frame narrative wherein this courier gallops through the land, going from village to village, where he hears stories and shares some of his own on the theme of vice. Now, Hugo von Trumberg was not a cleric, but he was affiliated with the school attached to the Church of St. Gangolf in Bamberg, and his almost 25,000 line long disquisition in the Der Renner text manifests and embellishes upon standard medieval Christian conceptions of sin, drawing on ancient and theological authorities. But Hugo's Middle High German parables on the sins of pride, greed, gluttony, unchastity, envy, anger, and sloth are in a decidedly earthy and often humorous register. And the versified text is arranged in zippy couplets, making it engaging to read and hear. So, what about dancing in Delchen? Those tanzenden Leuten I showed you a bit ago, you ask. Well, dancing isn't much fun without music. And so here, in a different Delchener manuscript, we see a pair of richly costumed fellows, each with a shawm, a conical double-reed woodwind instrument like an oboe. This manuscript that I'm showing you now is from the same cultural orbit as the codex I had up a moment ago. This one here also localized to the Tyrolean region, dated to the 14 teens, and likewise on paper. The text mocks the musicians for puffing away so that their cheeks swell up. This one blows here, the other blows there, until all their breath is depleted. The image on the facing page illustrates the dancing which that music inspires. We see a cramped cluster of folks gotten up in the height of fashion, the two women in long gowns with extended trains dragging on the ground, and the men in tight leggings with short jerkins cinched at the waist. And here I focus in on that dance vignette. The artist evokes the flurry of the carol, where men and women shuffle amongst one another, zigzagging around the dance floor. The man at the right is particularly geared up for the party. He wears a broad-brimmed headdress open at the top, giving view to a mop of golden locks. His legs are encased in dandyish two-toned hose, and his jerkin is trimmed at the bottom with a band enhanced with large beads or bells. This male figure strides to the right, breaking out of the frame of the image, evoking the dynamism of the dance floor. But in the accompanying text, it is the ladies in attendance who are particularly unbounded. Hugo von Trimberg places his most extensive consideration of dancing in the section of his treatise dealing with those who are unchaste, von der Unkeusche, and he observes that maidens step onto the dance floor at first very daintily, but thereafter they increase their excitement, cavorting about as if in a rage. Who could praise this foolishness, he asks. In the Innsbruck manuscript I've been showing you, however, the ladies are not depicted leaping about. Far from it. They hardly seem to be dancing at all. More frank about the risks of unrestrained physicality on the dance floor is the rendering illustrating this passage on dancing in a Delchener manuscript now at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. This codex also is from the Tyrolean region and dates to about 1460. It is on paper and is the most richly illustrated of the 10 extant Delchener manuscripts that have extended pictorial cycles. On the left, you can see the musicians who come in for scorn. At the center is a man blasting his bagpipe, and to the right is a fellow banging a drum as he toots a three-holed pipe. With garters at the knee adorned with bells, he can shake a leg and heighten the cacophony as the party heats up. The musicians spur on a crew of dancers who spill across the double-page spread, the staggered placement of the figures evoking the jostle of bodies weaving around a lively ballroom. Continuing with my consideration of the accompanying text, in Hugo von Trimberg's reckoning, ladies too easily lose themselves with the fun of the fest. How unfortunate, Hugo observes, that many maidens show more grace when they are skipping around in dances than when they are in church, the place of prayer. And the text goes on to say that should one be so unfortunate as to hear the loud chatter of such maidens when they're in church, one would understand how they distract the poor priests who are just trying to go about their business with the Mass. Focusing more closely on the visual, the images in the Morgan Library manuscript have a remarkable tangibility, capturing the hustle of the scene through forceful pictorial style. With bold strokes of the pen, the illuminator articulates strong contours and uses hatching to formulate shadows. Plasticity is enhanced through an array of washes, confidently modulated to create soft highlights at the figure's knees, shoulders, and chests. The renderings of these bodies refined by firmly delineated passages of white, as evident in the calves of the long-haired fellow in blue, and the crisp chaperon framing the face of the lady behind him. The linearity of this artist's style and his capacity to maintain a clarity of form while depicting a cluster of figures advancing and receding in space suggests that he may well have been an engraver, or at least was compelled by the graphic dynamism promoted by the new medium of intaglio print, just finding a broad market in the middle years of the 15th century when this manuscript was made. But turning from issues formal back to those iconographic, it is over to the left on the facing page, the one that with the musicians that we were looking at earlier, which directly responds to, but actually inverts, Hugo von Trimberg's text. The Derrenne verses denounce women for getting predatory at the dance. Such maidens I have seen, says Hugo. They circulate around or close in on men more than the men circle them. But in the image, the artist makes plain that the man's moves are the ones that are aggressive. The fellow at the left, coiffed with the curly bob of a courtier and wearing the slashed sleeves that were a mark of conspicuous consumption, makes a bold grab for the breast of his lady companion. She wears a crown typical of southern German Fastnacht finery, but she seems to be rather a reluctant party girl. She raises her right hand in self-defense and with her left clutches the wrist of her would-be groper. Hugo von Trimberg's text was popular in the generations after its composition, with most of the 65 extant manuscripts of Derrenne created between 1340 and 1480 in the southern part of the Holy Roman Empire. And the 10 Derrenne manuscripts that are extensively illuminated all date to the 15th century, and only one of them is from the region outside of Tyrol. So when the illuminator of this image got to work, he was given the opportunity to repackage a text that was enjoying a bit of a vogue. And that artist seems to have known something that the author of this text resisted acknowledging, that as often as not, men are the ones whose libidinous drives need reining in. Or, put another way, faced with a text about naughty maidens, the illuminator winks to his audience, scrambling the scenario and emphasizing the aberrance not of the lassie, but of the lad. Now, as I mentioned, Hugo von Trimberg was not a cleric, and his Derrenne text was a sort of do-it-at-home digest of broader societal moral codes. A look at the sermons of a popular preacher enriches our understanding of these codes, but also, I note, suggests the firmness with which people clung to their vices, including the practice of dancing. So, the preacher whose text allows us to explore these issues is Berthold von Regensburg, who was active from about 1240 to 1272, and whose sermons circulated and served as models across Bavaria and Austria to the end of the 15th century. And here's an image of Berthold von Regensburg in a mid-15th century manuscript now in Vienna. Berthold is withering in his denouncements of dance, condemning it alongside the social ills of murder and thievery, and likening decked-out ladies on the dance floor to horses for sale, by extension, prostitutes. But Berthold also knows his audience. He is good at meeting people where they are, and he is practical, recognizing that sacred ideals did not always align with the realities of urban existence. This awareness comes across when he deploys a literary conceit, injecting in his text a voice of the people, unruly objections raised by fictive members of an ornery audience. So, for instance, in the course of a sermon on the Ten Commandments, where, in observation of the Sabbath, non-pious activities such as dancing, drinking, and other pleasures are denounced, a dissenter offers a challenge, saying, "Hey, Brother Berthold, you sure would have us do absolutely nothing. What are we supposed to do with our time on the Sabbath?" And when Berthold responds, telling his listeners that there are plenty of activities with which they can keep themselves busy on a Sunday, going to church, praying, caring for the ill, and so forth, the fictive heckler in the crowd bursts out with, "Brother Berthold, say what you will, but we don't want there not to be dancing. Wir mögen ungetanzt nicht sehen." Of course, Berthold von Regensburg and Hugo von Trimberg were not the only Christian authorities who objected to dancing, nor were they the first, nor the last, by no means. These high medieval authors drew on an extensive body of patristic denunciations, many of which associated dance with unchristian practices. Those of the ancient Israelites, the idolatrous dance around the golden calf being seen as an sin, or Salome's tumbling taken to be the quintessence of feminine lasciviousness and treachery, or dance being understood as an unsettling vestige of ecstatic ancient Greco-Roman cults. Elements of Berthold's admonishments were adopted and amplified in later sermons and tracts, such as one known as Schaden tanzenbringt, that is, the harms caused by dancing, found in a compendium manuscript from southern Germany dated to 1437. And here's a page from the manuscript on the screen now, and you can see the red underlining of that title about the dangers brought on by dancing. In this text, one finds the now familiar admonishments, for instance, warning that dance leads to impure thoughts, directing one away from God and the sacraments. And the treatise advises men not to be ensnared by seductive ladies at a dance party. But it is not just participating in a roundelay that is hazardous for the soul. Returning to the concerns of the men of the Nuremberg Rat with which I open this talk, the Schaden text frames the whole discussion with an assertion just a few sentences in that even those who stand by and watch dancing become servants of the devil. And I've put that snippet of text up and bolded the words about onlookers. There was a keen awareness, that is, of the porosity of the boundary between viewership and participation. And like the councilmen of Nuremberg, who levied fines on performers who spurred men and women to tread onto the dance floor, showing off perhaps some unseemly new dance moves, the clerical author of this text seeks to find a way to tamp down practices already well in play in city streets, here not through taxes, but with threats of eternal damnation. But the clerical minority of society did not speak for all people at all times in the Middle Ages, even if their texts are the ones that are best preserved or best known by art historians. People had things to contemplate beyond dwelling always on the ultimate fate of the soul. So, to get at late medieval lay attitudes toward the here and now, as opposed to the hereafter, I turn to a body of work associated with the vernacular poet Neidhart von Reuental, an author who seems to have been active in the Bavarian Austrian region in the first half of the 13th century. On the screen is an image of Neidhart from the Manessa Codex of circa 1304. The dainty rendering of the central figure here is absolutely at odds with the blunt and bawdy tone of the tales attributed to the poet. There are a whopping 150 Middle-High German songs, or Lieder, given to Neidhart, many of them composed in the 14th and 15th centuries, in the spirit of Neidhart, though not by the original poet himself. So Neidhart songs become a veritable genre, crowd-pleasing and fashionable in the southern part of the Holy Roman Empire at the end of the Middle Ages. And dancing features as a key theme running throughout those works. Now, as an art historian, I must admit that I find it disappointing that there is not a rich tradition of illuminated manuscripts illustrating Neidhart's tales. There are, however, some low-quality woodcut images augmenting the earliest surviving printed Neidhart compendium published in Augsburg in 1495, one of which you see here. And I can share images from this incunable as I give you a taste of the way in which dance figures in the songs. Multiple Neidhart lyrics are structured as dialogues between mothers and daughters, often with the Mutter, like that shown here on the right, trying to dissuade the Tochter, here the maiden who's with the loose hair on the left, from going to a dance. The mothers warn that at such events, young ladies lose their inhibitions and circulate among men, and that all too often the girls end up pregnant. The joke consistently is that the daughters do not heed their mothers, and indeed, this young lady here seems already to know all about how things go down at the dance. The inscription indicates that the girl's nether region is on fire or is smoking, and that therefore she needs a man. It seems that a later viewer of that woodcut on the right intervened, perhaps seeking to protect the modesty of the maiden by inking over her groin. The result, however, has the appearance of pubic hair, or perhaps the smoke, or rauch, referenced in the caption. Now, I noted that there does not appear to have been a developed tradition of illuminated manuscripts featuring Neidhart's texts. But it does seem to have been common for the domestic abodes of lay people and for taverns to have frescoed walls dedicated to Neidhart themes. As you might expect, such works were not preserved well over the centuries. They were not in the palaces of nobility or in ecclesiastical spaces. They were part of the furniture, so to speak, often in urban mansions of high-ranking burghers, and they usually were plastered over in the post-medieval era. I'm showing you remains of such frescoes uncovered in recent decades in Vienna and Zurich, both in the homes, I note, of Jewish businessmen. The paintings contribute to evidence of Jewish participation in the social and cultural life of late medieval European cities, which is a fascinating topic in its own right. But I use these frescoes to exemplify a fashion for Neidhart paintings in domestic spaces more broadly, since they are among the best surviving examples. Now, that said, the paintings have lost a good deal of detail, but one can make out that there are figures dancing in a chain in both ensembles. And in the fragment on the right at Zurich, I think it is easy to see a musician in red blasting a horn at the right edge. It seems that these were just the kinds of images that raised the rancor of churchmen, as exemplified in a rebuke from one Nicholas Rutze, a university master active circa 1500 up in Rostock, so northern Germany, who laments that lay people, instead of adorning their walls with renderings of apostles, prefer to paint scenes of the Neidhart dance or other naked and unchaste images of ladies and sirens with bare breasts. And I have that text now on the screen with the references to the Neidhart dance and to the bare breasts in bold. So I'm afraid I don't have any renderings of topless mermaids to share, but I can show you some images of a so-called Neidhart dance that is better preserved than those examples from Vienna and Zurich. This is a mural in a building in Regensburg, a Bavarian city about a 2-day walk from Munich, and a trade center on the Danube River linked by roads to Nuremberg to the north and Innsbruck to the south. Here on the left, you can see a photo of one corner of the first floor of the building at Glockengasse 14 in Regensburg, with a fresco at the left showing an array of people clasping hands in a chain dance. And at the right, I've given you a detail of a bagpipe player. And here, closer in, is a section of that chain dance with participants arranged boy, girl, holding hands and moving toward the viewer's left with, sorry to say, a big patch at the center, only faintly visible. The names inscribed above some of the figures tether the depictions to the scenarios and characters found in Neidhart lyrics. And there are details of the ensemble that make vivid the fashions of the day and bring us back to themes found in Hugo von Tremberg. The lady at the center of this shot wears a decorous green gown, narrow at the waist and trailing on the ground, as was a la mode in the 14th century. But a female figure off to the left, which you can see here if you strain your eyes, wears the kind of getup that might quicken the pulse of a dance partner. On top, she wears a drapey surcoat, demure in its coverage. But with her left hand, she reaches back, bending her elbow to reveal an armhole cut so low that it reveals her slender midriff ensconced in a clingy gown. This feature was called the Teufelsfenster, or devil's window, and it was denounced by moralists. So here's another iconographic element recalling the notions also found in texts linking dancing to the sensuality of women. Now, the images on which I've been focusing mostly don't look much like dancing per se. Sure, we see men and women decked out for the party and mingling in the company of musicians. But most seem to sway or shuffle along at best. Not so, however, the guy next to our well-dressed lady. He is downright buoyant. And here I've faded out the lady to make more legible the fellow in question. Though admittedly there are extensive passages of loss in the fresco, one can see that his knees are bent and his feet spring from the ground. We get a sense of lively movement, the bouncing revelry of the dance. And we've seen this kind of springing before, just not in a depiction of characters taking part in a festive dance party, but rather in images that evoke performances, images that I introduced at the opening of this talk. Side by side, one can see how the painted figure here mirrors the movements of the sculpted one, now on the right, caught mid-motion, crouching to leap upward with the force of his bent right leg. The frescoed image dates to about 1360 or 70, and the sculpture is from about a century later, and together for us, they suggest the energy and even footloose excitement of viewing and participating in dance. Now, that sculpture is one of a series of dancers. There are 10 in all, and I'm showing you 4 of them, each shot from 2 vantage points. These figures were created around the year 1480. They were carved from linden wood and painted in the workshop of the most celebrated sculptor of Bavaria at the time, Erasmus Grasser. The dynamism of the figures is hard to miss. Focusing in here now, this figure holds his balance on his bent right leg while his left strains in a sharp diagonal, having moved in that direction with such force that the golden cloth tied below his knee flutters. The figure's arm juts off to the right, the thrust of the wrist rhyming visually with the acutely angled alignment of the right ankle. The dancer bends sharply at the waist, his whole body positioned like a hinge, poised to spring open. This dancer swivels his head sharply over his left shoulder, casting his bright-eyed gaze toward the viewer. His hips, meanwhile, shift back in the opposite direction, creating a compressed, coiled torsion in the figure as a whole. Tense, extended fingers vibrate with energy, captured in material form in the billowing gold of the dancer's doublet and drapey turban. Now, a compelling element of this cluster of sculpted dancers from Munich is that one of them is painted to appear as if he is of African descent. The polychrome on the Munich dancers was refreshed in a 1928 restoration, and so this figure's intensely dark skin tone perforce was inflected by 19th and early 20th century racist attitudes connected to minstrelsy. Worth inquiry, I think, is the connection between such renderings and the medieval and modern enthusiasm for blackface, especially at Fastnacht, though these issues are beyond the scope of my discussion here. But I do want to take a moment to explain the implications of the convention of calling the figures in Munich Moresca or Morris dancers, as you may have already noticed in my caption a couple of slides back. There was a period of about a half a century between 1450 and 1500 in the German-speaking realm when images of energetic male dancers appeared in a range of artistic and textual media, and references to them surface frequently in administrative records of cities and courts. The nomenclature used today for these figures is found in such 15th century texts, and even in the account books of the Munich Stadtkammer recording payment to the artist Erasmus Grasser for a suite of Bilden Moresca tanzt, or images of Moresca dancers. And I've put that snippet of text up on the screen. Now, that standard translation, Moresca, derives from the word more and variance, employed in the late Middle Ages to refer variously to people from Africa, people of Muslim faith, or people of non-European or non-Christian identities in general, often used interchangeably with the equally vague term Saracen. Early scholarship speculated that the dynamic dance moves modeled in the Munich figures originated in North Africa and Spain and then caught on in France and England and Germany and elsewhere, justifying a nomenclature marking the choreography as Moorish. These days, historians of dance dismiss such explications as simplistically causal and essentializing, though no one has offered an alternate term for the mode of performance. It does appear evident that, with flowing hair, fluttering scarves, jingling bells, and the like, these figures do operate in a register outside of the everyday for white Christian Europeans, moments of spectacle and revelry. And although it is a loaded and imprecise term, because it is the standard one used, I will refer to such performers as Moresca dancers. Now, it's hard to tell from the photos I've been showing you, but the Munich Moresca dancers are rather small, with the most upright ones measuring about 80 centimeters in height. And they were not created to be seen in isolation, as they were photographed in these pictures. Rather, they were part of a larger decorative ensemble ornamenting the ceremonial hall of the Munich Rathaus. This 1936 photo captures their original installation, with the dancers as one element in a decorative band of shields with coats of arms running at the top perimeter of the walls. You can see the Moresca dancer at the center, up on a little console, highlighted by my upright blue oval, and then an array of armorials on either side. And here's a 16th century rendering of the whole space with little blue ovals that I've popped in, marking the spots of the Moresca dancer sculptures. As you can see, they were inserted at regular intervals, punctuating a row of shields, and that row, in total, had some 100 coats of arms, referencing the empire and its political allies. So here are a few of those armorials, alongside some of the Munich Moresca dancers. This juxtaposition of dancers with symbols of political authority brings me back to issues raised at the outset of this talk. Because here we are at a Rathaus, a town hall, this time in Munich, not in Nuremberg, and this selection of motifs, Moresca dancers with armorials, makes quite palpable a tension at the end of the 15th century between a popular zeal for freewheeling dance moves and the political imperative to regulate the temporal realm. People were eager spectators for this new dance form, and in some way, as suggested by the texts I shared at the opening of this talk, these viewers were getting in on the action themselves. Churchmen taught that such revelry only could lead to trouble, with ladies misbehaving and destabilizing a social structure putatively governed by a fear of damnation. But we know that the drive to dance was not fully suppressed, because indeed there was a whole written and pictorial culture exemplified by the works connected to Neidhart, attesting to the irrepressibility of dancing. So maybe the deployment of dancers and images of civic order at Munich was a case of, if you can't beat them, co-opt them. Dance was a part of social life, like it or not. Might as well concede that and show it as something that could be harnessed by the state. But Moresca dancing could not be fully appropriated by those in power, no matter what might be suggested by an officially sponsored image program. By the late 15th century, the recently developed medium of intaglio print made possible to an unprecedented degree intimate engagement with minutely rendered images within the domestic sphere. The graphic delicacy of engravings and dry points allowed artists to render fictive worlds with a pictorial tangibility that invited viewers to imagine themselves into idealized or satirical scenarios, to enter an arena where the regulations of the city wrought had little bearing. This engraving of Moresca dancers both furnishes its viewer with a vision of the dance craze of the day and models the fun of blurring the boundary between spectacle and spectator. The work is by Israel von Meckenem, a remarkably prolific artist who trained in southwestern Germany in the mid-15th century. In the image, the round format used enhances the sense of the whirling movement of leaping men, accompanied by a jester and a musician, encircling a woman who holds aloft a ring, a prize to be awarded to the performer she finds most pleasing, as suggested in related texts. The audience depicted at the back of the space rendered here find it hard to stay on the sidelines. They reach through the window at the back, pushing to get closer, or perhaps to enter the fun themselves. They may have been excited by the get-ups of the dancers, which are similar to those of the Munich Moresca dancers and of the men in the Morgan Library Dechana manuscript I discussed earlier. Lay literature gives voice to the desires that could be ignited by men dressed in tight pants with short jackets. German epic poets speak of men's leggings that appear to be painted or glued on, as in the quotes on the screen. And in Possible, Wolfram von Eschenbach describes a lad dressed in scarlet hose and exclaims, "Goodness, how beautiful his legs were! A boy, wie stunden seine Beine." Little surprised to find this evidence suggesting that it was not just ladies decked out for festive occasions who aroused feelings of lust. We can imagine that the men's costumes that we see here, snug leggings with short jerkins showing off a shapely rear, could be enticing for many onlookers, tempting folks of all kinds onto the dance floor. Another sculpted decorative ensemble similarly integrates a prize-giving lady with male Moresca dancers. This is a three-tiered loggia in Innsbruck, affixed to the Neue Hof at the center of the city. It is known as the Goldenes Dachel, or Golden Roof, named for the roughly 2,500 gilt copper shingles crowning the structure. It was built between 1497 and 1500, and its upper parapet is adorned with reliefs by the artist Nicholas Turing, showcasing Moresca dancers. You see a few of these sculpted panels, you saw a few of these sculpted panels already at the opening of my paper, and now in these details you can get a fuller sense of the program, where the dancers spin and bend and leap in pairs, flanking renderings of the Emperor Maximilian with two ladies, perhaps his successive wives, Mary of Burgundy and Bianca Sforza. And you see the emperor in profile in the relief at the center. The insertion of an image of the sovereign with Moresca dancers echoes the combination of motifs we saw at the Munich Rathaus. But here the focus is more on Maximilian's legendary enthusiasm for festive celebrations than on political authority. And now, I note that the iconography of the Goldene Stachel overall is complicated, having perplexed generations of scholars, not least the many who have toiled to this day unsuccessfully to unlock the meaning of the puzzling text in the banners fluttering across the reliefs. Many of the particularities and nuances of the pictorial program of the Goldene Stachel are secondary for us here, however, and I remain focused on the way in which Nicholas Turing's reliefs manifest aspects of and attitudes connected to the dance trends we've been exploring. Now, many have observed a parallel between the array of characters at the Goldene Stachel and the Israel von Mechelen print that I already showed you. The gyrating Moresca dancers aiming to win the favor of a lady holding a ring or an apple as a prize. And now I brought that print back and zoomed in on the sculpted image of the lady next to Maximilian holding an orb. And I'm showing you now some other selections from Turing's relief cycle of Moresca dancers, in details that I showed you already at the opening. So, in principle, the lady with the orb is the focus, but the dancers sometimes seem to be rather engaged with one another. I call attention to that hand position of the dancer on the right. The move itself, a cupping gesture aimed toward the nether regions of his partner, begs consideration in comparison to that man getting handsy on the dance floor that we saw in the Morgan Library manuscript of Der Renner. While Hugo von Trimberg's moralizing text blames women for heating things up on the dance floor, perhaps triggering a man to lose control and make a play, in the Goldene Stachel reliefs, we can see a keen awareness that fit male bodies leaping and shaking it also could arouse lusty actions, and in this case, the fellow who is the object of desire does not seem to be put off by the overture. We can see men and women together delighting in the kind of arousal ignited by a freewheeling dance in this drawing from the so-called medieval house book, a manuscript created sometime after 1482, perhaps in the Rhineland, and which was in Innsbruck in the 16th century. The image is complicated, featuring some 25 small figures engaged in distinct vignettes. So let me walk you through it. At the top is Venus, riding an armored steed. This page is one among 7 presenting the children of the planets, and thus on other pages we see Mercury, Saturn, Jupiter, and so on, similarly celebrated as guiding forces determining the character and inclinations of those born under their sign. Venus's children like dancing and canoodling. In the lower right are 4 male and female pairs dancing in a procession, sashaying to the notes sounded by nearby trumpeters and a hurdy-gurdy. In the middle ground at the left are 2 youths busting out some Moresca dancing moves, spurred on by a standing musician. All the music making and dancing gets to be a lot, and before we know it, a couple has scooted off from the party to get busy in the bushes. And if there was any doubt about what might be happening with all that amorous grasping in the right middle ground, in the lower left we get a clear view of a man and a woman who have stripped off their clothes and are happily taking a bath together. The verses on the facing page of this image celebrate the connection between dancing and dalliance, and are notably free from the misogynistic tone found in other texts I've shared this evening. So now on the screen I add in a shot of that text page and a transcription of key lines of the Middle High German verses that accompany the Children of Venus image. The lines read, in translation, "Plucking harps and lutes, singing and strumming, the children of Venus enjoy the music and also play well. Organs, flutes, and trombones, dancing, necking, kissing, and whispering. tannczen, helsen, kussen, und rawmen. And the text concludes with, beholden always to things unchaste and to lovemaking, thus are Venus's children for all time. A note in the curatorial file for the Morgan Library's Depicting manuscript observes that there are stylistic affinities between the illuminations in that codex and the productions of the housebook master, both artists working in pen and ink in the second half of the 15th century. And this comparison of that lower right corner from the Children of Venus image from the housebook does echo some elements of the Morgan illumination. The pointed chins and rounded jawlines of some figures, the mincing ankles and shapely calves of the men, the heavy fabric and crunchy folds of the women's gowns, though, admittedly, those are all elements characteristic of the graphic arts in general from the Middle Rhine and the Bavarian Austrian regions around 1460 to 80. But I'm intrigued by that suggestion of an alignment of the graphic style of the housebook master and the images in the Morgan Depicting manuscript. And there is no doubt about a connection between the housebook master and Israel von Meckenem, the engraver I discussed earlier. Israel von Meckenem was both an innovator and a copyist who reworked compositions by his forebears and contemporaries, including designs by the housebook master. Both of these artists experimented with intaglio at a time when this medium made newly possible in Europe the replication of minutely rendered designs featuring innovative themes. These compositions could depart from the standardized iconographies of saints and Christ's Passion and other devotional motifs that dominated the earliest productions in the print medium, and rather offered up new subject matter to spark the interest of urban consumers from the burgher ranks, presenting scenes that spoke to daily interests and diversions. And now again, I show you that round engraving with Moresca dancers and a lady, as well as another print by Israel von Meckenem on the right, one that nests Moresca dancers and a central Fräulein into a strip of ornament. In these examples, Israel von Meckenem seems to capitalize on the dance craze of the moment, creating images to meet the tastes of consumers excited by the spectacle and even the suspense of a Moresca performance. And I note that these works apparently were popular, since to this day they survive in large numbers, with some 45 known extant impressions of the round print on the left and roughly 80 for the strip of ornament on the right. The men dance wildly, shaking their booties, bending and twisting and lunging, while at the center, a lady, ever demure and the embodiment of chill, holds aloft a ring or the apple she will proffer to her favored dancer. The ladies there don't seem to mind their roles as judge in So You Think You Can Dance, Moresca edition. But here, this lady is so over it. This image is one in a sequence of 12 engravings by Israel von Meckenem showing couples, each with a man and woman, sometimes antagonizing one another, sometimes cuddling up, or sometimes, as here, perhaps tolerating one another. The woman is marked clearly as a hausfrau by the cluster of keys and household utensils hanging from her belt. But her companion is not keen to stay in for the comforts of an early bedtime. He is dressed for a party, looking something like a Moresca dancer himself, with tight hose and short jerkin, though he is so eager to hop about as he tries to balance a double cup on his forehead that he hasn't taken the time to tie up the laces of his booties, and his money purse is strewn on the floor. Two blank banderoles undulate in a lively tangle, evoking the moves of a roundelay on the dance floor, and together creating a horseshoe-shaped arch over the pair. The cluster of ribbon at the center affixing the two scrolls together marks the woman and man as a couple, tied to one another. So the man is shown as energized and perhaps foolish, while the woman seems resigned to her partnership, but not necessarily ready to join in on her husband's revelry. And perhaps for a lady like this, it was worth thinking twice before stepping out for a jig. The denunciations of a Hugo von Trumberg or a Bertolt von Regensburg castigating female libidinousness on the dance floor might be hard to shake off. Maybe better to be a wallflower than scorned as a harlot, one might conclude. But moralists do not always get the last word. Sometimes, when the musicians got into a groove, when men in tight hose began to get down, even a jaded or overworked lady of the house could embrace an opportunity for fun, accepting an invitation onto the dance floor, busting out some new dance moves, whatever the elders of the city rock may have thought. That is, the loudest voices that survived from the Middle Ages, of course, were those of the men in power. They may have sought to control the when and the how of urban merriments, but they don't always get to dictate how we understand human experience of the past. Images in print, a medium typically understood by art historians to herald secular possibilities of the early modern age, can inspire re-evaluation of works from prior generations. With a closer examination of some overlooked images and a little imagination, we can be sure that there were times when the ladies of the house were glad to get out on the floor and dance the night away. Thank you.